Lee Griffin. I'm going to continue with our volleyball officiating for 2020-21 for the Triangle Officials Association. This is our virtual clinic number 3, and I'm going to be going through rules 6, 10, and 8. So starting with rule 6, that's the team composition and the positions on the court. Terminology-wise, team members will be considered everyone in the bench area. That's the coaches, players, the statisticians, assistant coaches, anyone that's associated with the team in the bench area would be considered a team member. That's important in case of interference or whatnot, as a team member could not interfere with their own teammate, while someone like a person from the press could. The players, we have to have 6 players on the court, and remember we discussed you have to have 6 to start the match, but you can continue with fewer than 6 if you have fewer than 6. If you have players on the bench, you must play them. You cannot decide to run with 5 players or 4 players. You must play players if they're on the bench and in uniform. We have a playing captain in volleyball. There's 1 captain per team. They're designated by the head coach, and they're designated when the lineup is presented to the R2. That captain can be changed by the head coach, but they're designated per set by the head coach. They're not designated at the pregame match or anything like that, so don't ask for the quote speaking captain at the pre-match conference. It'll be designated per set by the head coach, and the playing captain has to be on the court. So if the playing captain is substituted for or replaced, then we'll ask the coach, who will now take the role of the playing captain. That's important because the captain has some responsibilities that no other player on their team does, which is to communicate, first of all and foremost, is communicate with the referees. So they can ask the referee, either the R1 or the R2, to repeat a call, or they can communicate with those referees. They cannot communicate with the line judges. So they're not to ask the line judges any questions. The captain or the head coach can call timeouts. It's very rare to see a captain call timeout, but it is permitted in high school. The captain or the head coach can also ask for the number of timeouts they've used, as they determine whether or not they want to maybe call a timeout. They can ask for the serve order for their team, which means they'll normally ask the R2 this, the down ref, and when they ask that, your responsibility as the R2 is to make sure that they're in the right position on the court relative to each other. In other words, their serve order position on the court. The captain cannot ask for the serve order of the other team, but they can ask, is that server the proper server? And finally, they can ask any question like, what was that signal? What was the call again? We missed the call, things like that. The captain is very important. Encourage them to ask questions. So we have 6 positions on the court: right, center, and left, front, and back. Let's look at what they look like on the court in just a moment. I think that'll be easier. One other player that we can have on the court is the libero. So libero was introduced a number of years ago as because it added excitement to the game. We had more participation. We can have now more players, in particular players that aren't necessarily all extremely tall. So there's no requirement other than that this person will be in the back row replacing another player. They're designated on the lineup. In high school, we can have 1 libero designated per set. They can be the captain, and they can serve in 1 serving position. And they may, under certain circumstances, be used as an exceptional substitution. That'll be very rare. Primarily, they're going to come in and most likely be the person that is the very best defensive player, the person who can dig the ball the very best, because they're restricted in offense. We'll talk about tomorrow or in section 4. Okay, positions on the court. I've set this up where, as you see on the left-hand side, this is the team that's receiving, and the left front, center front, right front, left back, center back, and right back. And this is a lineup you'll see. And if you ask the players when you're checking the lineup to go to base, if you say go to base, they'll go to their base positions, which are these spots on the court, and then you'll be able to do a lineup check. But this is not how it looks when they're playing, right? This is not how they'll start out. It will be quite this simple. And we need to check alignment. So the requirements and the reason we have these definitions are for the point of service. Okay, so this is the other side of the court, left, center, right. Okay, so it looks pretty simple, straightforward, right? Nothing to this part. Okay, now what matters about these positions is at the moment of service, all the players except the server have to be entirely within the court. Remember, the lines are part of the court, so they can be touching the line other than the center line. They can be touching the sideline or the end line, and they're still in the court, but they have to be entirely within the court, and they have to be in the correct serve order. So I'll read through the words, and then we'll go through some pictures, and you'll see what this means in practice. So all the players on the right side, so the right front and the right back, must have at least 1 foot or part of 1 foot touching the floor closer to the right sideline than the corresponding center player. Okay. Left players likewise have to have 1 foot closer to the left sideline than the center players. And then the front row players have to have at least 1 foot touching the floor closer to the center line than their corresponding back row players. Okay, and then for all of this, we're going to ignore the position of the server. They're under no restriction other than if they serve from within the serve area. Okay, if you violate any of these, either not entirely on the court or one of these things we call overlapping, that would be result in illegal alignment and a loss of rally and point to the opponent. But let's look at what this really means. So call on the left, or left, center, right, left, center, right, front, and back. And I've added lines here to indicate in this case, the 7 relative positions that we need to be aware of. Okay, so the left front has to be in front of the left back. Okay, center front, center back, right front, right back. And the left front has to be closer to the left sideline than the center front. And so likewise for the right front. Okay, pretty simple. Let's look at a real lineup. So this would be a lineup the team receiving might actually have. Okay, first of all, I'll start with the right back. In this case, the right back is very near the sideline and right next to the right front. The right front is actually going to try to cover up the right back because the right back turns out to be the setter. So the right back is going to move up toward the net at the moment of contact and attempt to not play the first ball. Okay. Likewise, if you look at the left front and the center front, notice those 2 players are going to also not try to take the first ball. They're going to try to avoid that, and they likely are going to switch positions. The center front is going to move to the left outside, and then the left front would probably move toward the middle, more near the middle of the net. But is this legal or not? Well, I've added lines to try to show that it is legal, because these are remember, we only had 7 relative positions, relative locations to check on. And so I've added lines to show all 7 of them. And it's really hard to tell up there in that left front, center front corner. But because the left front has 1 foot closer to the left sideline than the center front, they're fine. Center front clearly is, the right front clearly is closer to the right sideline than the center front. Okay. The left, center, and right backs are fine relative to each other, and all the back players are behind the front players. Okay. Here's another here's another case I've drawn up where we have the right back all the way up to the net, or almost all the way up to the net. In fact, you see she's moved up, and it's not going to take the first ball, probably the setter again. But notice that you say, well, that looks like that must be out of alignment. But remember, the right back only has to not be closer to the net than the right front. Doesn't matter that he or she is closer to the center front or the left front. It's where they are relative to the right front. Okay, now for the team serving, remember we said the server doesn't count. So in this case, we only have 5 relative positions. The left, center, and right front relative to the sidelines, the left back and the center back relative to the sideline on the left, and the position of the center back and the left back relative to their corresponding players. So in practical case, this is here's a lineup we might see. The right back, who is the server, is moved all the way over to the left-hand side to serve. Okay, they'll oftentimes serve from the middle, but oftentimes from the far left-hand side. And we look at our relative positions. Okay, so the right front is closer to the sideline than the center front. Okay. The center front is closer, I'm sorry, the left front is closer to the left sideline than the center front. And our back players, our 2 back players, left back and center back, are behind their position, their relative positions at the front. And left back is closer to the left sideline than the center back. But note the thing that you should be aware of, though, is that the right front, in the case of the team serving, they only have to be closer to the right sideline than the center front. So notice they're behind the left back, which is just fine. There's no restriction on that. So in all these cases, if at the point of service, in other words, when the serve is contacted, and these restrictions are not adhered to, it's going to be illegal alignment. Okay, and that's going to result in a loss of rally and point to the opponent. So when you're the R2, you're the down referee, you're looking at the alignment of the receiving team. You're going to have to determine when the serve occurs by listening for the contact to the ball, because you will not be able to see it. It'll be outside your field of vision. So when you hear that and you have illegal alignment on the receiving team, you blow your whistle and indicate illegal alignment. If the serving team has illegal alignment, the case that we have most commonly is that we have the wrong server. So the team has gotten confused, then they have send the wrong server back to serve. Okay, and when the serve is contacted by the wrong server, that's loss of rally to their opponent. Okay, and we need to make sure if that server had previously scored points in that term of service. In other words, they'd scored a point, to 1 or 2 points, and then we recognize it's the improper server. Those points would come off, as long as we discover it before the opposing team has won the serve and has contacted their first service. In other words, we cannot cancel points once the other team has won a point and has served. Okay. Now, alignment, as we discussed here, is really hard follow. It's much easier to do, on the chalkboard as we talk through it. But there is a video that's available out on the NFHS Learn, and I highly recommend you look at this. This is one that's out there. It's free, at least free right now. Go out there and do it. They have a really good course, about 20 minutes, that takes you through alignment. You can actually see this with players on the court, and then they give you a couple of cases for you to say, now, what was that? And you can watch it over and over, and it'll get it. Alignment is one of the harder things to learn how to instinctively understand in volleyball. You really have to be on the court to actually kind of get it. All right. Last part of the line in the section on players in position is screening. So screening is an illegal act by the serving team. So only the servers can screen. And it's at the point of contact of serve. It's the serving team causing the receivers not to be able to see the ball, the service contact to the ball, or the flight of the ball. Okay, and they can do that a couple of ways. They could stand very near the server, the ball would be served directly over them. They could wave their arms, move sideways, etc. Or the more likely case is you have two or more players that are standing close together from the perspective of the receivers, and the ball is driven directly over them, but not in a high looping trajectory. So if we have three of our three tall players standing side by side at the net, or at least side by side from the view of the receivers, and the ball driven directly over their heads, down close to the net, not looping high up above the net, but directly over them, that would be a screen. Now, I will rarely call a screen if the receiving team has not asked me about it. In most cases, they will be able to see the ball and see the contact of the serve so they can tell if there's a top spin or a float or whatever coming across. But if you have a screen, it's the loss of rally to the receiving team. You will only see this at the higher levels where the teams are doing this intentionally to get just that tiny bit more advantage over their opponents. All right, I'm going to go through Rule 10, substitution and libero replacement. Substitutions can be requested by the head coach. It can be requested by a player entering a substitution zone. I'll show you what this means in a second. And we allow a substitution when there's a dead ball before we call for serve. You can do one per dead ball, and you can do them prior to the start of a set. If it's not for illness or injury, it would count as one of your 18 permitted. So said the other way around, if it was for illness or injury to change the starting lineup, you would not charge the team a substitution. If it was not for illness or injury, then you're going to count that as a substitution. And the way you do that mechanically is you'll have the players out on the court as they were submitted on the lineup, and then the coach can ask for a substitution for one of their players, and then one or more of their players. All right, so the substitution zone, remember this is our picture of our court. The substitution zone here is for each team between the center line and the attack line. And in most cases, the coach may stand up, particularly if you're doing like a middle school match, they'll yell sub, or they'll stand up and rotate their hands like this. When they do that, that means they want a substitution. And if you have an R2, the R2 is responsible for a double whistle. And then we'll go through how they administer that. Okay, but that's the substitution zone for each team. And the other way you can have a request for substitution is for just a player to jump off the bench and run up into the substitution zone. All right. They don't have to say anything. As soon as they enter the substitution zone, so this is of course without play being underway. It's there's a dead ball. Um, in this case, number 3 jumped up off the bench, ran inside the attack line extended, and that's a request for substitution without saying a word. They will yell out sub, 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 but the actual entering of the zone by the player is the request. They cannot verbally request it. Only the coach can verbally request a substitution, the head coach. So in this case, 3 ran in. The R2 is going to double whistle, step to the side of where 3 is, and administer the substitution. So what will happen is player number 12, who's on the court, will come over, and once the R2 has released them, they'll exchange, and player number 3 goes onto the court. Okay. If there are multiple players on the same team that are going to substitute during that same dead ball period, only one can be in the sub zone at once. So in this case, you see 3 is in the substitution zone. 13 and 23 are both in the libero replacement zone. So they're beyond the attack line and away from the center line. And so once 3 is substituted, 13 will step in, 13 will substitute, and then 23 steps in and 23 substitutes. Okay. You can do this pretty quickly. You don't want to delay the game as you're doing this. You'll get faster and faster at it. And the point is not to slow the game down, but to make sure that our scorers have the correct people on the court and we know who's in what position. Okay, so the process is that request either by entering the zone or by the head coach verbally. We're going to recognize that by a double whistle, and then they were going to proceed without delay for the players to enter. If, say they didn't, say the head coach says, sub, or a player jumps off the bench and runs into the sub zone with the R2 dutifully is going to double whistle, and then they're going to say, oh, no, we don't want a substitution, right? And well, because they make a mistake. And so when that happens, that would be an unnecessary delay, right? So they've delayed the game unintentionally, most likely, but they've delayed the game. And so that would be the administrative yellow card for unnecessary delay. And we do that with our yellow card on the wrist. Okay, so but assuming they did want to do the sub, then the R2 will release the player onto the court and make sure that the scorers have it recorded. Okay, and you can do this anytime there's a dead ball. If there's a timeout and there were not substitutions prior to calling the timeout, you delay any substitutions till after the timeout is completed. Okay, so a bunch of players run up, to sub, and team calls timeout. Well, if you grant the timeout, do that, and then once the timeout is over, then you perform the substitutions afterwards. If they had already been substituted, if your team had already substituted a player in, and then the timeout was granted, they would not be allowed. They would not be afforded another substitution after the timeout. The other team could, but not the team that had already afforded a substitution. Okay, so when we substitute, the player that goes in for the player coming off goes into the same serve order position. All right. So in our example I had just a minute ago, number 12 was the middle back player, and they were replaced by number 3. So now number 3 is now the middle back as far as the serve order. Okay. There's no limit per player. There is a limit of 18 per team per set. If a player goes off, is substituted for, they can't substitute back in until there's been a subsequent dead ball. Effectively, there has to be a point played before they can re-enter. And remember, they have to re-enter back into the same position. All right, so a couple of bolded terms here. In this case, improper substitution. So improper substitution is using the wrong procedure. Usually that means the players goes up to substitute, and before the R2 has released them onto the court, they go ahead and enter. When that occurs, you bring them back and we correct the situation. There's no penalty for that unless you think there's some sort of unsporting conduct involved. But you correct the situation without penalty and move on. Okay. If we delay substitution, then we would have the unnecessary delay. So the condition I mentioned just a second ago was the request being withdrawn. In that case, we would have a delaying substitution, which means an unnecessary delay. Or if the sub is recognized and then they don't come up, right? You know, they don't actually come up to substitute. And then finally, it's under delaying substitution. But if the coach is coaching, remember they're going to be in that libero replacement zone, and they can talk to their players when the ball is dead. You know, they can be right up next to the court. But as soon as the R1 extends his or her arm to call for serve, they need to move away from the court at least 6 feet. And if they don't, that would also be a delaying substitution, or at least delay. And we use our administrative yellow card for that. Now, if you do one of these, if you're recognized and then you say, oh no, we don't want one, well, now you've used up your opportunity to substitute at that time. Now, one other thing that can happen is that a team may send up a substitute and they may then realize, oh, we meant to send up 2 substitutes, right? So the first substitute comes up, you grant them entry into the set. The second substitute is not there, then it's too late. You can't then recognize again. So they've got to be ready immediately after you've granted the first one's entry. And how fast immediately is going to be your judgment. In those cases, you would just deny the subsequent substitution. All right. We can also have illegal substitution. And there are two common occurrent cases of this. One is where a player reports for the wrong position. And the only way it can be a wrong position is if they've been in a previous position of the court during that set. So 3 and 12 are substituting for each other, and then 12 goes up to substitute for a different position, right? So they're not substituting for the position that 3 was in on the lineup card. Then that would be an illegal substitution. We will deny that, and again, we're going to do the unnecessary delay, and we're not going to allow any further substitutions for that dead ball. The other thing that happens pretty commonly is there'll be illegal equipment, in which case it's usually jewelry. A player will show up with some sort of jewelry, wristband, or earrings, things like that, and they show up in the sub zone with that on. We're going to deny that substitution, and we're going to penalize the team for unnecessary delay because of that illegal equipment. And then the player would be sent back to the bench, and then they can correct that, and then the next opportunity they could sub. So a team is allowed 18 substitutions per set. When the team uses their 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th substitution, the R2 is responsible for informing the head coach that those have been used. So when you're checking the score sheet at a timeout or even during play, you can ask the scorer how many substitutions has the team on the left used. So also check that when there is a timeout, make sure if you have say a score sheet from the home and the visitors, make sure not only that the scores are matching, but that the number of substitutions used match. So as you get down to the end of the set and the team may be running out of subs, you'll correctly inform the head coach, because when they get to 18, they cannot have any more substitutions except under some uh, unusual circumstances with injuries. Okay. So relative to injuries, if a player falls ill or is injured, as long as there are no signs of concussion, then that player can be, after they've been removed and substituted for, they can go back into the set unless they were substituted for using the exceptional substitution. In other words, they had already used all 18. So exceptional substitutions are only allowed in this following order. So you can't go to number 3 unless number 1 and 2 are not available. So the exceptional substitution would be a player that has not played or has played in that position. Okay, so player is injured, the team has no more substitutions, but they're always going to play with 6 players as long as they have anyone on the bench. So player's injured, we will then put in a player that has either not played at all during the set because they clearly could go into that position, or a player that has played in that position previously. So in our case with 3 and 12 subbing for each other, if 12 was injured, 3 could go into that position, as could any other player who had not played in the set previously. Okay, if that's not available, you can have a non-libero player that's played in another position go into that to replace that injured player. Now, the reason that's exceptional is because normally they would not be allowed in. So this could occur even if the team hadn't used all 18. So if a team only had 7 players, it only had 7 players that had no libero. So they had 6 players on the court, and the 7th player had been substituting for, 3 and 12. If another player got injured, well, obviously number 3, who had been subbing with the number 12 position, normally would not be allowed in. But in case of injury, that would be noted as an exceptional substitution and would count toward the team's substitution numbers, but they would be allowed to play in another position. Okay. This is, of course, only if the condition 1 cannot be used to permit the exceptional substitution. The last alternative is if there are no non-libero players and there are no players. Basically, all you have is the libero. Well, that libero could be redesignated as a position player. He or she would have to change out of the libero jersey or the uniform top into the standard uniform top, and they would then be a position player. And the team would play without a libero for the remainder of that set. So this is extremely rare for this to occur. Just be aware of it. It really only occurs when teams end up having only a very, very few players on their team. All right, we talk about liberos and libero replacement now. So the libero replacement zone is the area between the attack line and the end line in front of each team's bench. So if we zoom in, you see that those 2 areas, and in this case, there's no whistle or any indication when the libero replacement occurs. We do have a libero tracker at the scores table, keeping track of these replacements. So remember, our libero has our immediately distinguishable uniform top. You can have 1 per set in high school, and they can replace any player that's playing on the back row. And we are not counting those as substitutions. They're merely libero replacements, and our libero tracker tracks who is exchanging with the libero. So the key point, other than that they have to be in the back row, is the libero must be replaced by the player they replaced. So in other words, when the libero is going to go back off the court, the player that has to come back on the court is the player they replaced. Okay. They can be the captain, remember, and they can also serve in one serve position. So if the libero is currently in the playing on the court, and the team was receiving and won the serve, the libero can go directly from whatever position they were in to the serve position. Okay, so if they say they were in center back, if they were center back, they're going to now rotate to left back, but the team won the serve. They could instead go directly to the serve position, and then the person that they had replaced would come in and be the left back. Okay, that can only occur at when the rotation occurs. All right. Now, when can you do libero replacement? Well, you can do it once per rally. After a rally's over and the ball's dead, and the R1 is not called for serve yet, you can have the libero replace a player on the court. And you can do it before the beginning of the set. So after the R2s check the team's lineup, the libero replacement can occur. So they can play from the very first point. Okay. If the libero is injured, they can be replaced. They are to be replaced by the player that they had replaced. Okay, so libero's injured, they're in for another player, then that player would go back into the court. And that occurs, oftentimes the team is going to then subsequently substitute for the player that went back on the court, because they're probably not the best defensive player on the team. Okay. You can redesignate a new libero. So if the libero, remember their libero is designated per set. So within the same set, if you want to, a team can designate a new libero for that injured libero. But if they do that, the injured libero could not come back within that set. They could come back in the subsequent set. And of course, any person playing as libero must have a libero uniform, and it must be a unique number. So they can't have the libero get injured and then go, take her to the locker room to administer to the injury and have another person come back with that same uniform number. It'd have to be a different uniform number. Okay. If we unfortunately have a libero disqualified, if the team will play without a libero for the remainder of the set, they can designate a new libero for a subsequent set. Okay. And if a teammate is disqualified, so the libero could not be a substitute for that teammate. The substitute for a disqualified teammate would have to be another player, non-libero player on the team. If we have illegal libero replacement, there's two conditions of not following the procedure. And the one that occurs most commonly is before calling for serve, the libero either runs through the substitution zone instead of through the libero replacement zone, or they run through the back line and they're not going directly to the serve position. Basically, they're not following the right procedure, in which case we would administer the unnecessary delay yellow card and then call for serve after we followed the correct procedure. Now, if they, and I have had this happen, if you call for serve and then the team realizes, oh, the libero is supposed to be out there, but you've already called for serve, the libero is going to kind of hesitate, and coach is going to not realize the call for serves occurred, and she's going to run out there on the court, And when that occurs, as soon as the ball is contacted, we're going to blow the whistle, and that's going to be illegal alignment. So, because you can't do the replacement after the call for serve, we're going to have a point one way or the other. Cover Rule 8, the serve. So the serve is how we start each and every point, and you do that by hitting the ball with either one hand, fist, or arm. Any part of your arm can be used to serve the ball. The ball can be held in a hand, or it can be tossed, released up. You can dribble the ball, things like that, as long as you're not going to judge that as an attempt to release it for serve. You have 5 seconds from the time the call for serve is done by the R1. So 5 seconds, and you want to be a little lenient with that. Other forms of the game use 8 seconds. So a lot of players will take 5, 6 seconds. So unless it's excessive, you're gonna let that go. We do have a few girls that take 8 seconds, and I've called it on them a few times. You have to serve from within the serving area beyond the end lines, and you can jump up as long as you jump from beyond the end line, and you can jump into the court. You can jump outside the court as long as where your feet were when you took off were completely inside the service area. And for purposes of reserve, we need to know about two terminology things. One is called a team term of service. Okay, and so that begins with the rotation to the right back position. In other words, the team has won they were receiving, they won the point, and now they're going to have a term of service. And that might be for 0 points, but it could also be for 25 points. It could go on and on. That's the team term of service. A player's term of service it begins when they assume the right back position and ends when there's a loss or rally or they're substituted for. Right. So I've seen it where girls serve 15 in a row, and a team will say, hey, they'll take and replace her with another player. Right. And so her term of service had ended when she was substituted for, but the team term of service might continue. That would continue until there was that loss or rally. Okay. So the reason those terms are important is only one thing, and that's the reserve. Okay. So when a server releases the ball for service and then they catch it or it hits the floor and they did not contact it, with any part of their arm. Okay. So if they toss it up in the air and then they catch it after, this is of course after we've called for serve, then there's going to be a reserve. Okay. In other forms of volleyball, that would be illegal. So that would have been their chance. They tossed it up. It was a bad toss. They don't get another toss. That would be a point for the other team. So, but in high school, we allow for this reserve. If they catch it, that's fine. They can hit the floor, that's fine. And then will be permitted a reserve. Each player is only allowed one reserve per team term of service. Okay, so remember that was the time that the team was in that particular rotation and serving and scoring points. They're allowed once per. If they do it again within that team term of service, then that would be illegal and be side out to the other team. While we're in a reserve, in other words, there was a call for serve, they threw it up, dropped it, we stopped the play, call for another serve, reserve, call for serve. During that time period, there can't be any sort of a request. You can't do a timeout, sub, libero replacements, anything. We're going to have that serve occur one way or the other. Okay. And then, I don't know that we mentioned it before, but the first serve, remember at the pre-match conference, we had the coin toss that was done by the R1 to determine who would do the first serve. Okay, and then we're going to alternate for each set who serves first. And then for a deciding third or fifth set, we're going to have a coin toss administered by the R2 to determine that. Okay. So what kind of things can cause the serve to be illegal? Okay. So an illegal serve would be something like hitting the ball illegally. In other words, hitting with, say, with two hands, or hitting it with your head, or kicking it, or whatever. More commonly, it's going to be that the server is actually touches, the inline with their foot, or they're outside the service area on either side, or they don't do it within 5 seconds. It's the wrong person. One that we see very rarely is if they deliberately serve before the R1 calls to serve. In most cases, when they serve before the call for serve has occurred, it's just merely a mistake. They don't, they're excited and confused. So we're not going to penalize for that. We're just going to say, no, hold on, wait till I call for serve. Okay. And remember, if they try to if they have a reserve requirement a second time, that would be an illegal serve also. Okay. Now, service fault, basically, it's just a serve that does not go over the net between the antennas. So it hits the floor, goes under the net, hits an opponent, goes outside the antennas, hits the ceiling, etc. Those would be service faults. So the reason the previous terminology is important is only in the case of the receiving team being out of alignment as well. So if the serving team has either an illegal serve or a service fault, clearly we're going to give the point to the receiving team and the term of service is going to end. So if the receiving team happened to be out of alignment at the same time, then we need to know how to administer that. So receiving team is out of alignment and the serve is illegal. In other words, it's they used two hands to serve the ball, or they ended up requesting a reserve twice. In that case, we're going to penalize the serving team because a legal serve has not occurred. So remember, their out of alignment would occur at the point of the legal serve. Okay. If we have a legal serve, but the serve is a service fault, well, we're going to penalize the receiving team because if you think about it, when the serve occurred, the service fault may not occur for a second because it might not hit the ceiling yet. But the receiving team was out of alignment at the point that serve was contacted. And so we're going to penalize the receiving team. That pretty much covers the serve. It's relatively straightforward. So I hope everyone has enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you in our next session. Here's my contact info. Again, if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.